Okay, so friends, family, colleagues, fellow fish heads, thank you all for joining us today for the defense presentation for Brian Mason. So Brian came into what turned out to be a more complicated project than may have anticipated, because Mother Nature decided that she had some different ideas than what Dr. Hopewell and I had planned. But Brian came into a project that had been started by a previous student, carried on for 2 years. After that, experienced floods and all sorts of kind of interesting changes related to that. He won't really talk about what happened after the elevation increase in Harlan, but he will focus on the first 2 years, 2017 and 2018. He's the first Harlan student that is defending since I've been here, which is exciting for me, and continues on a long tradition of excellent students who work on Harlan County Reservoir. So with that, Brian, take it away and coordinate 2 presentations simultaneously.
Okay, well, I'll do my best for sure. Thanks for the introduction, Melissa. And like she said, today we're going to be talking about my work for my thesis, my master's thesis down on Harlan County Reservoir. So, oops, one sec. Gotta admit people. Okay. So, giving it away for the other people. All right, first I'd like to thank everybody who's helped me with this project. I definitely couldn't have done this by myself, so I'd like to thank first and foremost my graduate committee and all the instructors that I've had here at UNK. I'd also like to thank anybody here at UNK who's helped me with the project. That includes grad students, student workers, full-time staff. Everybody that's helped me with this project has been a huge help in getting me here today. I'd also like to thank all the staff at the Nebraska Game and Parks who've helped me plan, manage, and overall utilize their equipment, allowing me to utilize their equipment in order to conduct this research. And then finally, the folks down at Army Corps of Engineers down at Harlan County Reservoir have been a great help in getting this project up and going and hopefully finalized here as well. So with that. So today, just a brief outline of what this presentation is going to be about. We're going to first introduce the concept of cove isolation within reservoirs, and then specifically relate that to what's happening down at Harlan County Reservoir. We're going to go over the research objectives that we're planning to go over in this study. The first one being a comparison of water quality and zooplankton within different habitat types of these disconnected coves, connected coves, and the main lake of Harlan County Reservoir. The second objective that we're going to talk about is comparing fish assemblages between disconnected and connected habitats of Harlan County Reservoir. And then finally, we're going to talk about the management implications and the future research that this spurs up. So as many of you know, dams can be very valuable to human society. Dams can provide hydroelectricity for local communities. They can provide withhold water for drinking and irrigation purposes. They can control flooding in large river systems, and they also are used recreationally for angling communities and motorboats and water sport folks as well. Because of this, dams are built around the world, and they have been for a long period of time. This figure just shows the areas or locations of large dams throughout the world. And as you can see, throughout the developed world, and more so becoming in the future of the underdeveloped world, dams have become a major part of the landscape through those regions. During the mid-1900s, there was actually a really large boom in large dam construction, likely for those benefits that we kind of discussed earlier, the hydroelectricity, flood control, irrigation, that kind of thing. And that kind of followed the World War II and the Great Depression, and was kind of correlated with a lot of work projects that were getting people out to work in. More large dams and dams in general, dam construction was part of that. This figure would be the left for you guys. You can see that there was a large bubble in dam construction between the 1950s and 1980s. And this has kind of resulted in a large number of dams that are now reaching more mature ages of their kind of life expectancy, and they're reaching more advanced stages of their life expectancy. So as reservoirs age very similar to main or natural lake systems, except for there's one very big difference between reservoirs is that they often age at an accelerated rate compared to natural lakes. Dams are often placed on the landscape to maximize water capture, and with that, you also capture all the sedimentation that is coming down, or sediments that are coming down within those watersheds as well. So because of that, dams often accumulate sediment and have sedimentation issues much earlier than a natural lake would be projected to. Additionally, dams and reservoirs are often built in areas of soil that are highly erodible because they have never really had the experience to be inundated with water. So these soils and bedrock, all these landscapes are often highly erodible to wind and water erosion. The culmination of these factors these factors kind of culminate into the loss of habitat or the degradation of habitat, or even just the modification of the habitat over time within these reservoir systems. One of the phenomena that we've been noticing that can occur as reservoirs get older is the isolation of backwaters or cove environments within these reservoirs. Backwater isolation occurs due to the process that you mentioned before, sedimentation or erosion, by these sediments moving laterally across the shoreline and forming a sediment spit or a berm within the mouth of the cove. This is often seen in marine environments, as you likely have seen, like spit form islands, and this figure is actually from a marine type publication. However, the same phenomenon and same principles are active at work within large reservoirs. One sec. Okay. So this type of phenomenon of cove isolation has been occurring at a few spots now, especially with this large boom of reservoirs that are starting to mature in age. One of the prime examples is in Lake Mojave, Arizona, in the Colorado River, an impoundment on the Colorado River. And as you can see there, the sediment berm has completely isolated the Yuma Cove there from the main reservoir due to sediment erosion and lateral drift of those eroded sediments. Additionally, in Alabama, we also see it in some more streamlined reservoirs there, in the Demopolis Reservoir, as these coves were historically connected, but due to sediments falling out of the water and erosion of that shoreline and creation of that spit or berm, these sediments are now developing a berm that is cutting off that cove to the rest of the reservoir main stem. And this isolation can be a real problem because coves are relatively unique and could be an important part of any reservoir system. Coves are often shallow areas of the reservoir that is, and most reservoirs are mainly comprised with deeper water habitat. So these coves can provide a different type of a habitat within the reservoir matrix. Additionally, coves have been found to have be different compared to the main reservoir in water quality, as well as within zooplankton communities, with zooplankton that have often having a higher association with plants or aquatic submergent macrophytes. And coves are used by fish species a lot for either spawning and nursery habitats, such as we see with crappie and largemouth bass, but as well as used for feeding grounds for larger pelagic predators, such as walleye white bass if you're from the Nebraska area. With cove isolation, though, we really don't know how these factors are impacted, since this is such a new phenomenon that is occurring within these aging reservoirs. And very little research has been conducted on the effects of cove isolation on these isolated habitats. So, and with that, this brings us to our study area of Harlan County Reservoir. So Harlan County Reservoir is the second largest dam or reservoir in the state of Nebraska. It's not the second largest dam, but it covers an area at full pool of over 5,000 hectares. It was built in 1952, so right in that nice boom of that boom of dam construction back in the mid 1900s. And it was mainly built for flood control and to reserve water for irrigation. As you can see in this figure here, Harlan County Reservoir does have several coves, and some of these coves, being nearly 70 years old, are starting to experience these cove isolation phenomena that we were discussing. So this is a picture of Tip Over Cove, taken by drone in 2017. And as you can see, there is a large berm of sediments that has developed in that cove mouth that cuts that cove off of that water body and isolates it from the main lake during all times except for some extreme high water events. So Tip Over Cove is not the only cove within Harlan County Reservoir that is experiencing this phenomenon, however. We also have Indian Hill Cove, Methodist Cove, and Bone Cove that have also had documented berm development within their cove mouths. Indian Hill, Tip Over, and Methodist Cove have berms that have developed so significantly that they are often disconnected from the main reservoir for long periods of time, such as that kind of seen from 2013 approximately to 2019. Bone Cove, on the other hand, is more intermittently connected. Its berm isn't quite as developed as these other coves that are more disconnected. So it is typically connected to the main reservoir on an annual basis. Other coves within the main lake, within Harlan County Reservoir, include Gremlin and Patterson Cove, which are actually dredged, so they maintain their connection on an unnatural, in an artificial way, pardon. And then Prairie Dog Cove, which is naturally protected and large enough that it has not developed a significant berm to do much isolation of that cove there. So for this study, today we're going to compare the water quality parameters of connected coves, disconnected coves, and the main reservoir throughout Harlan County Reservoir. Our second objective will be to compare the zooplankton communities between those three habitats I just mentioned, the connected coves, disconnected coves, and the main reservoir. And then lastly, we're going to examine the fish assemblages of disconnected coves and connected coves, and to see if there's any if disconnection has had an impact on these communities. To make things easier for this presentation, we're going to first start and tackle the first two objectives, looking at water quality and zooplankton assemblages. So for our methods, we first had to divide coves into categorized coves within Harlan County Reservoir. This was done by examining the berm height that was previously mentioned, and anything that had less than 1 meter of connection throughout the study was considered a disconnected cove, so it didn't have surface water connection. These coves include Methodist Cove, Tip Over Cove, and Indian Hill Cove. All other coves that had either berm with over 1 meter of connection during the study or no berm at all were considered connected coves. We also sampled the main lake in each of the one of three zones you can see here, zone 1, 2, and 3. And we sampled those at the 4 sites signified by the triangles there. Sampling occurred in the spring, summer, and fall of 2017 and 18. And sampling was conducted at 4 sites within each of the reservoir coves and the main reservoir, like I previously mentioned. Here's an example of the sites within Tip Over Cove. And all 4 of those had both zooplankton and water quality was done in tandem at all the sites. Oh, I'm sorry. For water quality, the parameters that we examined in the study included temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, relative chlorophyll A, turbidity, and Secchi depth of the water column. During 2018, we also included some nutrient variables such as dissolved phosphate and dissolved nitrate within the study. So in tandem, like I mentioned earlier, in tandem with the water quality collection and analysis, we examined or collected zooplankton using a vertical toe of the water column, using an 80 micron mesh net at each site. Samples were preserved in ethanol and taken back to the lab at University of Nebraska, where they were then identified, counted, and their densities calculated per liter of the water column of tow. For the data analysis, differences in water quality parameters of total zooplankton and total zooplankton densities between habitats were examined using general linear mixed models, followed by a Tukey test if there was a significance of less than 0.1 with our alpha. Zooplankton communities were compared between habitats by examining the percent assemblage of each taxa within the entire zooplankton community. And in addition to that, a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination was used to better visualize differences within each habitat type's zooplankton assemblages. So I'm going to start with the water quality right now. They're going to see a lot of graphs that look very similar, but don't worry, we'll review it at the end. I have a nice little table to summarize it. It'll be very nice if you miss something and forget something. But all these figures are going to look very similar, with kind of the main effect of the habitat type being over here on the left, and then seasonal effects or interactions will be on the right. So for temperature, we can see that dissolved oxygen, disconnected coves had higher temperatures throughout the study compared to the main reservoir. Connected coves, on the other hand, had more intermittent values between those other two variables. We also saw a significant effect caused by season, with summer having higher temperatures overall, which shouldn't really be that surprising to you all because it's hotter in the summer and colder in the spring and fall. So kind of what we expect. For dissolved oxygen, we actually didn't see all the habitat types we examined were similar throughout the study period when looking at JAT alone. But there was, again, a seasonal effect with spring and fall having higher dissolved oxygen compared to the summer. Another thing we kind of expected, since warmer water tends to hold less dissolved oxygen than colder water. One interesting caveat, however, were the disconnected coves during the summer period. Although they were statistically, or they were similar values throughout the summer, and there was no significant difference between them, disconnected coves did drop below 5 milligrams per liter, with some specific case values being down as far as 1 or so milligrams per liter. So that could lead to, that has the potential to really impact the fish populations, especially since when you think about the disconnected coves, there's very little refugia to escape to when you're a fish in a kind of small isolated system, especially if the dissolved oxygen is going down to critical levels. Next, we have pH, which was one of our less exciting in regards to significance variables that we kind of looked at. Again, all the habitat types had similar pH, and there was really no seasonal effect of pH. Disconnected coves did have some large variability, if you can see their standard error, but realistically, it was all very within a slim range of normal pH you see in the water. Now we're going to start getting into some of the more broad patterns that we've seen within water quality. So relative chlorophyll A was found to be significantly different between all habitat types, with disconnected coves having the highest chlorophyll A and the main reservoir having the lowest. Additionally, we did see a seasonal effect of chlorophyll A, with the spring and summer being similar to each other in their relative chlorophyll A, but the fall having slightly elevated readings. Similar to chlorophyll A, we saw that disconnected coves and all the habitats had unique values of turbidity. with disconnected coves having the highest readings and the main reservoir having the lowest readings. There was also a seasonal effect in regards to turbidity. With this case, the fall and summer were similar to each other, and the spring had lower turbidity readings overall. So turbidity or water clarity was lower, or particulates in the water were lower in the spring season. Again, similar to the last two variables we examined, Secchi depth, which is how far you can drop a white and black disc that you can see in the corner into the water column and see how far you can see it, was significant between all habitat types. Disconnected had the shallowest depth of Secchi, so you could only drop it down a little bit, while the main reservoir you could drop it down, quite a ways and you could still see it. And there was significant difference between the habitat types. There was also a significant seasonal effect on Secchi depth, with the water being clearer or having a deeper Secchi depth within the spring season compared to the summer and fall. For dissolved nutrients data, we start with nitrate. There was no significant difference between any of the habitats that we looked at for nitrate. And again, there was no, likewise, there was no seasonal effect of nitrate on the readings that we recorded. So nitrate was pretty consistent throughout the 2008 when it was collected. This was unlike dissolved phosphate, which was a little bit more interesting in the results that we got there. As you can see, there was no habitat type effect. So all of the habitat types had overall a similar dissolved phosphate reading throughout the study period. However, this is one of the only variables that we had with interaction effect between habitat and season, which indicates that season might be driving some of the habitat, some of the dissolved phosphate within each individual habitat. For spring, we can see that disconnected coves have elevated dissolved phosphate compared to the other two habitat types, connected coves and the main lake. But interestingly, in the summer, we didn't see that pattern at all. We actually seen kind of a reverse of that pattern, with disconnected coves having lower dissolved phosphate, while connected coves and the main connected coves had the highest. The main lake was kind of intermediate and similar to both habitats in that case. And then finally in the fall, we saw that all three habitats were similar to each other in dissolved phosphate, and there was no significant difference. So kind of an interesting variable with phosphate. All right, so in case you guys missed anything, overall the results show that habitat type was driving differences between these variables. Temperature was higher in disconnected coves compared to the main lake, and a lot of the water clarity and productivity variables that you see, like the chlorophyll A, turbidity, those were all high in disconnected coves compared to the main reservoir, with connected coves kind of having intermediate values. And then just so we included with this analysis, there was no difference between habitats for phosphate. However, they did have a significant seasonal interaction effect. So that could be indicating that there's some seasonal or some unknown factor that is driving this variable that we're not really sure about. So for zooplankton densities, moving on from water quality, they also differed between habitat types, with disconnected coves having much more, significantly more zooplankton per liter than the other two habitat types. Connected coves were also significant, but they were at intermediate levels compared to disconnected coves and the main reservoir. But the disconnected coves really had blew them out of the water in terms of how much zooplankton were in those systems. When we look a little bit further at the zooplankton assemblage of those zooplankton communities, we can see that there's again some major differences between the different habitat types that we examined. The main reservoir was mainly dominated by Naphtali and Calanoidea with a fair amount of Daphnia as well. And this is a little different than the connected coves, which still had a lot of Naphtali, still had a amount of Calanoidea, had reduced Daphnia assemblage or abundance, and also had a lot of this brown area over here, which is rotifers. So we're starting to see more rotifers within the system as we get closer to the shore and into these cove environments, cold littoral environments, compared to the main reservoir, who had pretty negligible amounts of rotifers. And then when we get to disconnected cove, that kind of gets on, it kind of goes on overdrive when it comes to rotifers, with having over 50% of the assemblage being comprised of rotifers. Again, there are some other major differences, such as the reduction of Calanoidea and the reduction of Daphnia. And there is also some significant or more bosmina within the assemblages of disconnected cove, which could be related to possibly increased vegetation within these systems. When we look at the community a little bit further using our ordination, we can see that these habitat types do differ quite a bit from each other in ordinal space. So this figure, it shows the non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination. And the, excuse me, the black circles indicate the main reservoir, the gray triangles indicate connected coves, and the white squares indicate sites within disconnected coves. So straight off the bat, you can see that the main reservoir has a smaller area, more concise zooplankton assemblage, meaning that they have more similarity between those in the assemblage between those sites. Moving on to connected coves, we do see a lot of overlap with the main reservoir. However, they have a much larger distribution of within the ordinal space, indicating there's a lot more variability in the zooplankton assemblages themselves. And then finally, the disconnected coves, they have a much wider distribution with ordinal space, and they actually do not overlap at all with the main reservoir sites, indicating that they have a little bit more of an independent or unique assemblage compared to that habitat type. So overall, water quality site parameters did differ between disconnected, connected, and the main reservoir within Harlan County Reservoir. Disconnected coves were found to have high productivity and reduced water clarity parameters with higher chlorophyll A, higher turbidity, and lower sucky depth. Connected coves were, whenever they did have significance, interestingly, they were kind of in an intermediate stage between those found in the main reservoir and those found in disconnected coves. For zooplankton, densities and assemblages differed between the different habitat types observed. These differences could be driven largely by the different water quality that we see within the coves, as rotifers, which had a large percent of the assemblage within disconnected coves and some within the connected coves, are really tolerant of turbid water, which was found very often in, or that disconnected coves had a higher rating in. Likewise, Daphnia species, they are really intolerant of turbid water, and they could be kind of, less of them could be in the system because they are no longer able to survive, or fewer of them are able to survive within that environment due to the higher turbidity conditions. Additionally, there could be differences between the two habitats based on predation of the fish species that are utilizing them, but we haven't looked at the fish species that are utilizing them yet. So moving on, that will be our next objective within this presentation, is to compare the fish assemblages between disconnected and connected coves of Harlan County Reservoir. So similar to the zooplankton and the water quality parameters, fish were sampled at 4 sites within each cove using trap nets in the spring and fall season, as well as seines during the summer period. For each habitat type, the data was pooled together between different gear types to get a better picture of what the assemblage looked like over the entire study period of 2017 and 2008. For analysis, we looked at species richness between each cove, Shannon's diversity index between each cove, Jacquard similarity of the coves, also Raconen similarity of between the coves, and then to examine the species assemblage of these cove systems, we looked at and used a metric multi-dimensional scaling ordination, kind of similar to what we did with the zooplankton communities. And then finally, we used an indicator species analysis to examine if there were any associations of fish with certain habitats, either being disconnected coves or connected coves. Okay, so for the entire study period, we sampled a total of 24 fish species within disconnected and connected coves of Harlan County Reservoir. Within connected coves, we actually saw every single one of these species at least one time. So all 24 species were encapsulated within connected coves or were found in connected coves. Interestingly, however, connected coves had 47% of their assemblage, the entire assemblage found within connected coves, was comprised of gizzard shad. So they were a major part of the total assemblage within these communities. For disconnected coves, we lost a few species. Only 16 species were found within disconnected coves. And of those lost, we lost our white bass, our walleye, our northern pike, a lot of our pelagic, more pelagic large predators within these systems. Additionally, within disconnected coves, large percentages of the assemblages were comprised of common carp, orange-spotted sunfish, and black bullhead. And these species are known for their high tolerance to turbidity, as well as somewhat for low dissolved oxygen as well. So high tolerance for kind of less desirable water quality conditions. Okay. For the Shannon Diversity Index, we found that connected coves, even though they did have a lot of shad that made up a lot of their assemblage, they did have a higher diversity index than connected coves. This is likely due to the disconnected coves having a large percent of their assemblage being comprised of common carp and orange-spotted sunfish and black bull. For our similarity indices, for the Jacquard's index, which looks at the how similar the species assemblage, just looking at present-absent data of the species that are there, we actually have high similarity on that metric, indicating that there's a lot of overlap in the species that are present within these habitats, both connected and disconnected coves. The Raconen percent similarity index, however, shows that there is actually lower similarity in kind of the assemblage overall, even though there's a lot of similarities between just the species presence absence, the assemblages or the different amounts of each species within each habitat was different in driving this lower similarity index. For the ordination, we had some interesting results. So similar to the zooplankton assemblage, we had a large grouping of very similar and concise grouping for our disconnected coves. And those coves, when we examine the Spearman correlations of the fish species that orient themselves with those coves, species such as walleye, freshwater drum, largemouth bass, gizzard shad, white bass, all have a high correlation to the axis 1 where the disconnected coves are orienting themselves. Alternatively, for the disconnected coves, we see kind of two distinct patterns of species assemblage within the ordination. They're much more widespread, indicating that there's more unique species assemblages within these habitats. And when we look at their, when we look at their species composition, or Spearman correlation with their access values, we found that disconnected coves had a higher orientation towards two of the disconnected coves had a higher orientation towards centrarchid species such as orange spotted sunfish, green sunfish, black crappie, bluegill, and with the addition of black bullhead thrown in there. And then the other disconnected cove, Indian Hill Cove, was highly oriented towards common carp, or common carp was a main driver. In fact, that was the only species found within Indian Hill Cove during the entire study was common carp. For the indicator species analysis, we found that there were several species that were indicators of connected coves or had a high association with this type of habitat. And those included a lot of the same species that were found on the similar plains that had a higher Spearman correlation with the ordination. They include, red shiner, gizzard shad, walleye, white bass, a lot of your larger pelagic predators. Disconnected coves, on the other hand, they actually did not have a single indicator species that would go with it. This could be due to the large variation within the assemblages. Unlike the connected coves that have nice, concise, very similar assemblages throughout all the coves, the disconnected coves had a more widespread and variable species assemblages within these systems. So overall, disconnected coves and connected coves did have some marketable differences between their fish communities. Connected coves had higher Shannon diversity index, as well as species richness. And then they also had a highly consistent species assemblage based on the ordination and the indicator species analysis. One thing that could be driving these similarities between the connected coves could be their interchange with the main reservoir, as this provides a link for species to move around and kind of homogenize between these kind of habitats as they're more influenced by the main link. Disconnected coves, on the other hand, have a more unique species assemblage. And those species assemblages are often tolerant or comprised of species that are tolerant of poor water quality, such as the higher turbidity, perhaps lower dissolved oxygen, perhaps increased temperature during parts of the year. So the one question is, are these fish tolerant to these conditions because these were the conditions originally found there, or are these fish driving these conditions, as a lot of the species found within disconnected coves, such as the large amount of common carp and black bullhead, are known for their pelagic feeding and the kind of ruffling up of the soil and causing increased turbidity within these systems. So they themselves could be causing the turbidity that's making other fish appear to be intolerant to these communities. Additionally, with the Indian Hill Cove only containing common carp, and there's kind of the separation between the two different types of disconnected coves as seen with the ordination, this might have something to do with the time frame of disconnection. Both Methodist and Tipover Cove had only been disconnected for approximately 5 years during the beginning of the study, while Indian Hill Cove had been disconnected for approximately 25 years. So this could be causing, over a long period of time, the buildup and the buildup of this, or the sustaining of these water quality conditions, could lead to more and more of the community being comprised of these fish species that are tolerant to these conditions, to the point where there's only carp being sampled within that environment. So the management and implications of this study. What can we do with these disconnected coves or connected coves? Well, one thing we could do is reconnect them to the main reservoir to get more desirable attributes from them. If we assume that disconnected coves would behave more similarly to connected coves, then we would probably see markedly differences in water quality with reductions in turbidity, reductions in chlorophyll A, increase in the SEC, as well as the potential to have lower temperatures and increased dissolved oxygen or refugia from low dissolved oxygen during times of the year where it's needed. Dredging can be an important tool for developing this type of reconnection or maintaining this disconnection. And it has been used in the reservoir before, as I previously mentioned, within Gremlin Cove and Patterson Cove as well. Coves can also be reconnected via high water events, such as those seen and previously mentioned by in 2019. Here's a picture of me standing on Indian Hill Cove. As you can see, there's approximately a meter of water then connecting that cove that had not been reconnected to the main reservoir for approximately 25 years. This, of course, is a non-permanent solution, and any changes that would be derived from these reconnection may only be temporary. But more research is needed to see what can be done about this situation or management strategy. We could also manage coves as just unique, individual, isolated habitats. In other areas, such as the previously mentioned Mojave Reservoir in Arizona, these isolated systems have been used for rearing of an endangered species, the razorback sucker, that is endemic to the Colorado River. These coves have been very successful because they have the similar attributes or water quality parameters as the main reservoir, or they have more similar than a rearing pond and a hatchery. And there's a lot of ease of access for transporting. You don't have to transport these fish very far when they are at the stages where they could be stocked into the reservoir again. A similar management strategy could be used in other reservoirs with disconnected coves, not only for endangered species or management of those type of species, but it could also be used to enhance sport fish populations as well. Other lakes within Minnesota and within Michigan have been used by damming marshes adjacent to the lake, rearing northern pike and other sport species, and then allowing those to be put back into the main reservoir or main lake or reservoir, respectively, to increase the sport fish populations of that system. We could also manage these for just the unique assemblages that they provide to the rest of the reservoir. Similar to the 2019 high water event, similar events could occur, and when that does happen, these communities could then be used to reintroduce less common fish, such as the orange-spotted sunfish that is rarely seen within the main reservoir, and allow them to get reestablished and repopulate the main reservoir itself. For any of these management strategies, however, though, you would want to keep water quality in the back of your mind, since these coves appear to have a tendency, especially with the case of Indian Hill Cove and other coves within the literature, they seem to have a tendency to get worse and worse over time, with the case of Indian Hill, for example, becoming completely dominated by common carp, since those are the only species that was tolerant enough to live in there potentially. So management of water quality within these systems would be important if we were to use them as isolated systems. Continuing that thought, we could also manage them as more of a user resource instead of a resource to the main reservoir. And this way we could manage them for fishing or community angling. Disconnected coves, if they are managed properly, have the potential to have high amounts of centrarchid species, such as those seen in Tip-Over Cove and Methodist Coves. And those are really popular, very popular angling species, especially for those of using shoreline angling. This type of management strategy may require more infrastructure or roads to be developed into these isolated systems, as they are often remote, but they could offer some more angling opportunities without being connected to the main reservoir properly. Additionally, on that kind of train of thought, you could also, because these communities within these disconnected coves are more unique and offer different species that are often not found within the main reservoir, you could target other untraditional species angling communities, such as microfishing communities, and promote these locations as a source of ecotourism. Some future research in regards to this topic, it would be, if reconnection is to occur on Harlan, which is being proposed and the paperwork is being processed now, this study could be used as a baseline to see how these disconnected systems change after they are reconnected to the main reservoir. Additionally, succession over time of disconnected coves would prove to be valuable information If you are trying to manage them as independent isolated system, as you can see, how long of a time frame you have for them to become valuable after a reconnection event. Additionally, on that train of thought, you could also examine droughts during on the effects of droughts on disconnected coves, as these droughts have been known to exacerbate water quality conditions that could be problematic within disconnected coves, such as low dissolved oxygen, higher turbidity. This could accelerate the succession over time, leading to very quick succession into a more tolerant species assemblage, such as that seen in Indian Hill. And then finally, growth and condition studies within coves could be used to examine the growth of fish within these habitats as potential for resources for rearing habitat, or just as an angling community and for angling as a resource. And with that, I will take any questions.
So for questions, while we ask,
Brian, there might be some chat questions. For you.
Certainly.
So
Yeah.
yes.
Look, if any of those are up right now, you can repeat them for us and start that process.
Right now, there is no questions in the chat, but if anybody, feel free, if you are on and have a question, I will be more than happy.
I think Jenna's got a question for you, Brian.
Yeah, Jenna.
I guess, sorry if you answered this in your presentation, but why did you choose to use an MMS instead of an NMDS when comparing
That
your
is a great question.
versus, or why do you do zooplankton and NMDS and not MMS?
Certainly, certainly. So the NMDS is really good at displaying ordinal patterns in space. So it's often, you know, kind of the I don't want to say like the standard, because it's not technically the standard, but it's used a lot in ecological research. So that's the one I use for zooplankton, because it does really good with non-normal data and that kind of thing. However, I was planning to use it for the fish assemblage, but one assumption or requirement of a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination is that it doesn't like a lot of zero values. So the metric multidimensional scaling actually handles that a lot better, and it'll actually give you something that makes sense instead of just a bunch of dots in the middle of a graph, essentially, is what I calculated with the non-metric for the fish assemblage, because it doesn't really care if there's a lot of zeros. And for Indian Hill especially, I mean, that one had one value during the entire ordination. So it really couldn't comprehend the non-metric, couldn't comprehend that kind of data. But the metric did a really good job of doing that, and it's kind of, it's bread and butter. Yeah, Luke.
So you mentioned a lot of potential implications. So if you, like, these codes could be reconnected, they could be, especially with the disconnected codes. So they could be reconnected, they could be managed as a thing in their own right. So in your studying of them, what do you think should be done with that?
I think that is a very good question. I think that is very dependent upon the code resource itself, as well as, you know, the available resources that you have to renovate. These codes can, you know, they have the potential to be unique habitats. However, if you have coves with very easy access or very easily reconnectable, there's a lot of benefits that you could gain from reconnecting that habitat and making it more desirable for those larger pelagic species, especially if you're managing for those sport species that we see often in connected coves. You know, at the same time, if you have a cove with like Indian Hill, however, that is been disconnected for a long time, that kind of thing, it's not really, you know, the carbon there are, you know, it's got carp and other things living in the amphibians and birds that will be using that habitat. But if you're managing for sport fish or a diverse community, that cove resource is really not being as valuable as it could be. So that would be one that, you know, if it is in an Indian Hill, for instance, it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, it might be kind of difficult to get out there, and it might be difficult to prevent that berm from building up in the future too, since it's right next to a large hill and as log eroding away, it's going to continue to, create a berm. That one might be a better situation for, more sustained disconnection or management of more sustained disconnection, and kind of maybe renovating it to make sure that the carp aren't taken over either like by mechanical means, and then maybe stopping that and rearing that as like a potential for, using that to use stock into the main lake or as just a unique community of fish. Yeah, I think it's highly dependent on the cove itself and the resources that you have at your deployment. So, yeah,
Can you go back to the map where it shows where the different coves are?
certainly.
Can you repeat the question to those online here?
Oh, certainly. So I was asked to go back to the map of the coves. It's kind of back here. Oh, no, that's fine.
Yeah, that's right. So I was wondering where, so Indian Hill Cove.
Yeah, that's a great.
So you said that that was the one that has been disconnected for the longest time.
Yes.
Why is that placement? Why did that happen there and not somewhere else?
Sure. Let me just show them this map too. And then I will answer your question. So there's a lot of variables that are going into what is, driving the sediment berm development. It's kind of dependent on the reservoir, like, kind of I mentioned how the Lake Mojave has a lot of erosion on the sediments, kind of in the desert, very vulnerable to that kind of erosion, where the southern reservoir in Alabama had more of a sediment deposition going off of the mainstream and kind of just developing a berm into the slack water. For reservoirs, or for Harlan County Reservoir, it's unknown what is causing these. I can't say for certain what is causing these berms to develop. I think specifically for Indian Hill, however, just the size and the quickness, over time that berm has developed compared to the other ones. And Indian Hill is named aptly because there is a large hill right here that is eroding away as the reservoir has been there over time. And I think that as well as, the wind coming in, the headlong winds coming in from the west, I think that's very likely that that's more driven by sediment spit or erosion of sediments that have developed into the cove. And I think that overall, that a lot of that is happening in Harlan County Reservoir itself, because we see a lot of that within Bone Cove too, who hasn't really developed a big enough berm yet to be permanently disconnected. But you can see where the erosion has taken away off the landscape, and it's depositing that into the cove mouth there. So if I was to have an assumption, anecdotally, I would say that Harlan County Reservoir is more erosional or sediment spit driven disconnection. But that would be a great thing to study. Oh, yeah. Brian, you used a dichotomous design for assessments. This is from Kevin Pope. What likely would your findings and insights have been using a gradient design for your assessments? That is a good question. I'm assuming you're referring to the assessment of the water quality, which was done by a general linear model.
I think you might be referring to, you classify them as disconnected or connected rather than a gradient.
I see.
Yeah.
What we would see with that, it's kind of hard to classify, kind of in a ranking system, like using a gradient like that, because you could do it with like berm height or something like that. But you still have these two coves, Patterson and Gremlin Cove, that have been kind of artificially dredged. It would be hard to distinguish them from Prairie Dog Cove that has really not had much berm development, and kind of distinguish which one is at the higher end of the gradient of no berm development. If we did find a way to do that, I think that we would have more severe, the more disconnected, if you will, using a gradient design, the more issues I think we would have with water quality, with the differences in zooplankton assemblages, and with the fish assemblages too. And I think that's kind of markedly seen with the disconnection or the assemblages of the disconnected coves. With Indian Hill, you could say arguably might be the most disconnected cove of our study, and it had the most, just for the fish assemblage itself, it had the most advanced succession of that kind of variable. So that's what I would probably likely see if we did use that kind of gradient design in a study. So.
I think I have time for one more question from the room.
Bethany?
With the disconnected coves, were you able to get like water depth at all? Because I feel like that might play into like certain water quality.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Repeat the question.
Sure. So Bethany asked if we were able to measure water depth when we were taking these water quality and zooplankton variables. We did measure water depth. We did it by the depth of the toe of the zooplankton. So we'd go down and we'd measure. And actually, a lot of the variables we did for water quality were used an integrated sample. So we would take water at every so often and then integrate those together to get a water column, a value for the entire water column. And then that we kind of need to know the depth. So we do have we did measure toe depth. And I think you might be right. I think there might be some relationships between depth and a lot of the water quality parameters that we were seeing that may not necessarily be as in your face as you'd think. For instance, the zooplankton, we did an entire sample of the entire water column to make sure we sample all the species that are down deep and above. But if you think about a zooplankton, it's going to be feeding on some of the algae, kind of within the first several meters of the reservoir. So most of those are going to be within the top of the water column. And when you have a sample, a deep reservoir or a deep reservoir cove, like a lot of the connected coves are, you're going to be somewhat diluting that sample with a lot of space that doesn't have a lot of zooplankton in it. So zooplankton are the most like the apt one for that kind of situation. But there's also things like turbidity, closeness to the sediment and availability of or chances of those sediments being resuspended and reaching the top. I think that's very likely related to depth, because even if you allow the sediments on the bottom of a main reservoir, it might not reach the spot or where you're sampling specifically for an integrated water sample. So yes, I do think there is that might be driving some of the effects that we've seen.
All right.
We got time for one more?
Yeah. Anything for you, Barry.
Brian, as reservoir managers, we have a pretty small pool of money to use for habitat restoration on these reservoirs.
Sure.
Say I had a couple $1 million to spend on Harlan. Where would my best bang for my buck be? Restore one of the disconnected coves, or to protect one of the connected coves from future erosion, or
Sure.
maybe just put the money into other projects on the way to improve habitat? What would be the best for the fishery and for the anglers out there?
Sure. Well, the best for the fishery.
Repeat that again for-
Sure. So Brad Eifert asked, with a lot of management agencies have limited funds or resources to utilize these kind of, or to renovate these type of habitats. So what would be the best money, bang for your buck, if you will, in order to renovate? Would you rather reconnect a disconnected cove, or prevent one, maybe put some stabilization berms up that kind of grab that sediment and prevent it from forming a mouth or a berm in its mouth? Or would you just avoid that kind of problem altogether, since it's kind of an inevitable problem? To answer your question, I think it would depend a lot on the cove. If you had a cove that was easily and cheaply, renovatable, I think it could have some, that could be a good bang for your buck, because you're renovating these kind of lower quality habitats and getting a lot of benefit from those renovations. However, if you do so, you have to maintain that, kind of connection by either putting in a sediment berm or some other structure that would be there to capture and prevent that sediment spit from forming. So if you have limited funds and you don't know if you could connect it, if you could connect it, but you couldn't prevent those things, or put those structures in to prevent those type of things from happening, I would say you better not do that until you do, because you're just going to be wasting your money in the long run, because it's just going to become disconnected again. If you did have enough money to do that, I think it would be very valuable. And I think preventing coves from becoming disconnected is also a very good way to get on top of that before it happens. Because, you know, potentially the more disconnected the cove is, the more potentially more difficult it is to renovate it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, the committee will now dismiss to the private side of the defense and
Thank you.
go ahead and keep your Zoom on since we're